Welcome to The Generalist, episode 3. For this episode, I sat down with my good friend Jazmine Russell, who is a survivor of incest and an all-around unbelievable person, has a really personal story to share, and a lot of great wisdom to share with us as well. So stay tuned. If you like the show, rate us on iTunes. Check out our website at thegeneralistpodcast.com. Send me emails with comments or praise or, hate if you prefer, to thegeneralistpodcast@gmail.com. I prefer you don't send me the hate, but, whatever, it's going to happen. Follow us on Twitter at thegeneralistpc, and enjoy the episode. Welcome to The Generalist, a show with a man who knows very little bit about a lot. A man who specializes in nothing in particular. A man who knows that he knows nothing. A man who can be described as non-specific. And to top it off, he narrates his own intros. This is The Generalist with your host, Saul Ackerman.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jazmine.
Perfect. And for me, hello, my name is not Jazmine. Perfect. All right. Welcome to The Generalist.
Thank you.
I'm sitting here with my good friend Jazmine Russell. She is a social worker, an activist, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And a very kind and wise person. And let's see what we talk about. How you doing?
I'm pretty good.
That worked. Weird. So I did want to talk to you about mental health and stuff. I know you have a personal, very strong story. I heard that you recently did a class, or I don't know if you call it a class, but some sort of speaking engagement where you spoke about your personal story.
Yeah.
We don't have to start with that, but I would like to get your idea essentially on mental health and what the value of it is, and we'll get into it as we talk. We'll divert to wherever we do divert.
Yeah, I did just do a bit of a workshop the other day on psychiatric advance directives. So during that talk, I did give a little bit of my history. I talked about what creating a psychiatric advance directive looks like. And
can you first explain to me what a psychiatric... say it again.
Psychiatric advance directive.
Psychiatric advance directive.
Yeah, it's essentially it's a document in which patients who are typically in long-term treatment can explain to their doctors, their community, their peers what they would want and need during times of crisis and recovery. So it includes things like your preferred treatments, your preferred facilities, but also things like what your certain patterns are, what cycles you go through, which areas you struggle in, and what you would like your peers and your friends to do as well when you're having a difficult time. So that workshop went really well, and I got a lot of really good feedback.
Is that the sort of thing that social workers do, as opposed to? And I know I've asked you this before, and I asked this to pretty much everybody who works in mental health, and I've never gotten a concrete enough answer from either side, the psychologist or the social workers. Okay. What is the difference between psychology and social work?
That is a good question. I would say that psychologists typically either go down the research track or a more clinical track, which means sometimes opening up a private practice, but other times doing more psychological assessments, sometimes working in a hospital. Social workers tend to do their field tends to be a little bit more wide open. So social workers can work on healthcare policies. They can also work directly with families. They can also open up their private practice. I think private practice is mostly where those two terms overlap.
I see.
But social workers can work in a lot of different settings.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys do unbelievable work. I know a few social workers, you being one of them, and you guys do really nice work. You, I know, are... I don't know exactly what it is, but I know you're working on some sort of organization. You either want to get started or have already gotten it started. You want to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think I can really call myself a social worker anymore in a capitalist sense.
Why is that?
Because I no longer work as a social worker, and that's not how I make money anymore. So I used to work as a crisis counselor for a home-based crisis intervention team, and I recently quit to do grassroots mental health, or radical mental health, so to speak.
What do you mean?
At my previous job, as much as I enjoyed my coworkers and I loved working with families, I basically was a counselor, radical mental health.
Radical mental health. What does that mean?
Essentially, well, I guess there's a big difference between what I was doing and what I'm doing now. So in the past, I worked as a crisis counselor directly with children and families who were in crisis. I worked with them from 4 to 6 weeks and kind of came up with a treatment plan with them, worked with them on whatever they needed, whatever they were struggling with, and then referred them out to other services. There were a lot of things that I found problematic with that system. Not that it was an atypical system. In fact, it's very typical. But there were a lot of things that I ethically disagreed with, and therefore I decided to go into more grassroots organizing and found an organization called the Icarus Project, which is organized by and for people who are diagnosed with what we call mental illness. But instead, the Icarus Project takes a very open format and welcomes everyone, no matter what their preferred treatment is or how they interpret what's going on with them. You get people who do define what they're going through as mental illness and people who don't, but regardless, everyone who's in that group experiences, I like the term extreme states, and I've had a really awesome time organizing with them.
So before we get into more about the grassroots stuff, because it actually sounds really interesting to me, I'm interested in hearing what were your issues with the other format.
That's a good question. So essentially, I'll just say that the issues were not directly with my company, or my manager or coworkers or anything about the workplace. It was really much more about the way that the mental health system works. So in the beginning, you get a referral from a hospital, which means that the person that you are trying to help support automatically comes with a label, a diagnosis, a mental health history. That's already problematic because in that job, I was kind of forced to stick with that label.
I do understand that similar to I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner, as you know, and it's similar in psychology or in mental health as it is in Chinese medicine, where there's no concrete but there's no concrete forms of diagnosis. So the diagnosis is very dependent upon the person diagnosing, and different psychologists or different social workers or whomever is diagnosing, psychiatrists will have different diagnoses. And then, so I understand that if you're stuck to work with that, and that's not really the way you see the issue, it could be a big deal or a big problem. Is that sort of what you mean?
Right. Like, I want to clarify that just because I don't necessarily believe in diagnoses or the DSM as a means to create reliable diagnoses, because
I
it
love where
doesn't
this is
at
going.
all.
We're going to have a really fun conversation.
That doesn't mean that I don't believe that people need help.
Sure.
So from the beginning, you get a person with a label. And then from there, the way that it's set up is we're supposed to go in, do our little spiel about what the program is about, and then get consent from the family to work with them. Mm-hmm. There's this idea that the program is a voluntary program. However, once the family signs their name, it's almost like signing your life away, so to speak.
In what way?
Because once that happens, I, as the social worker or whoever the crisis counselor is, then becomes fully responsible for that family. That means that we have to create what we call a treatment plan for that family. And we say that we create the treatment plan with the family, which means we talk to them about what they want to work on, where they're struggling. For instance, if a child is struggling with what we call depression, then a treatment goal might be to reduce some depressive symptoms or to increase their self-worth or things like that. And it makes sense to have goals for your treatment. However, I found that more often than not, these treatment goals, which were supposed to be measurable throughout the course of the intervention, were very often just the worker's way of telling the family how they felt they needed to be treated, so to speak. So this would look like, the term that I hate the most, I think, is psychoeducating. The worker is supposed to psychoeducate the family on what depression means, what the symptoms of depression are, for example, and what the steps are to kind of overcome this or things of that sort. And then the other issue, the reason why I mentioned signing your life away, is because at that point, the worker becomes the expert and the family becomes the people who are being treated. So it inherently creates this hierarchy where I, as the worker, am the person who's the knowledgeable one, the psychoeducator, the person who knows the treatment plan, and the person who's forced to make the family comply with treatment. This means that if the family doesn't, let's say they miss 1 out of 3 meetings per week, automatically there becomes a discussion of, should we call ACS on this family because they're not complying to treatment?
Oh, wow. So it almost, once you sign it off, it almost becomes like a threat. Like, if you don't do this, you're going to be screwed.
Yes, it could be. It definitely could be. And these are families who, are already struggling, already have limited access to resources, and may already have an ACS record. And having a record of ACS, which is, I'm not sure exactly what it stands for, but kind of like Child Protective Services.
Right.
It's a very troublesome thing for families. So, in essence, what I found to be the most problematic about the system is just this air of compliance from every single angle. The family needs to comply to treatment. If they don't comply to treatment, there are certain consequences. I need to comply with my manager or with my higher-ups because if they tell me that a child is in danger of possibly being somewhat suicidal, even if I don't think that that child would benefit from going back to the hospital, even if the goal of this program is to prevent children or families from being hospitalized, that doesn't matter because there's kind of this fear of a liability.
Yeah, I do feel like there's a couple of things that play into the whole health field in this way. First of all, the fear of liability, in which people start doing things not because it's what's best for the patient or even what they believe is best for the patient, but because they're afraid of being sued.
Right.
And the second part is, I think in general, culturally, we have moved and we are moving more and more to a path of extreme logic. Yeah. And I think logic is very important. I'm not denouncing logic in the least, but we almost shun the emotional side as a part of it, and I think that there's a balance and there's a place and time for both of them. And especially when talking about mental health, which is, in a way, very much to do with emotions, if not entirely, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, we sort of ignore the emotional part of it and we say, no, it's got to be mathematical, A plus B equals C. And not everything works that way, especially when it comes to things that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, I would say nothing works that way. And the issue is that the model that's being kind of perpetuated at this point in time is the biomedical model. So that means that pretty much the main form of treatment is hospitalization and psychopharmaceutical drugs.
Right.
And that also means that I think a lot of people who are put through that system don't have any alternatives. I mean, when I looked at the different places as a worker that I could refer my clients to, all of those places were places that did not offer a variety of services, but pretty much strictly adhered to the biomedical model. So I also noticed that a lot of clients who would come in and out of this program or in and out of the hospital, especially children, they learn really early on that what they interpret or understand as their problem or the thing that's going on with them, that's not going to be heard or listened to. There's this air of compliance gets perpetuated again and again and again, so that it was so difficult for me as a worker to go into the home of this family and try. I mean, I tried so hard to act as a peer because I am a peer, because I was diagnosed. Even though that wasn't necessarily in my job description, I tried to create an even playing field, so to speak. But if children or families were already used to this system of, oh, you're the worker, I have to listen to you, you get to tell me what to do, so to speak, it's so hard to build a relationship that way.
Of course.
So I noticed that I would get clients who would kind of tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. like, oh yes, I will take my medicine every day. I have depression. Depression means A, B, and C. And at the end of the day, my biggest question was, hey, what do you think is going on with you? What do you think is the problem? What's happening? What's going on? And once those questions were being asked, then eventually, finally, once I said, hey, listen, I'm not here to tell you what you need to do. I'm not here to tell you what's wrong with your brain or with your mind or anything like that. We get to decide what kind of relationship we want to have. And slowly, I learned that that kind of broke down those walls, broke down that essence of compliance, and finally allowed a relationship to happen.
Yeah, that's really nice. I feel like a lot of people in the professional industries of health in general, it's almost like you're not allowed to create relationship of any sorts because of all the different, business reasons or liability reasons or everything like that. And it's become a thing where, like, no, you can't have a relationship with your patient. And I also, like you, I don't buy that. I don't like playing by those rules.
Right.
But I'd rather be a genuine human being and try and help somebody than, be a cold-hearted asshole.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind sharing a little bit of your story, and then we'll go into Icarus and you'll tell me a little bit about what it's about.
Sure.
Go ahead, because I imagine you have some sort of connection to this because of your own personal experiences.
Right. And the reason why I mentioned that I try to present myself as a peer is because I do have that lived experience. So essentially, my psychiatric history began when I was 17. When I turned 17, I suddenly had flashback memories of childhood sexual abuse and incest and emotional abuse. I was molested at the age of 3 by my father, and kind of repeatedly until I was 16. When I was 17, those blocked memories kind of resurfaced, as I mentioned, and I instantly just saw myself change.
So you had no, I'm sorry to interrupt you, you had no memory of it before then?
No.
Did you see it retroactively? Did you feel like it presented itself in any ways that you hadn't noticed?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, interesting. Can I ask you how?
Yeah, so, well, I take that back. Between the ages of 3 and 6, I had very visceral memories of it. They were very visceral. When I was 3, I tried to, grab any family member that I could and tell them, like, listen, this happened to me. Like, my father, he did this. This is what happened. And my mother knew about it, and I heard other family members talk about it, but it didn't really feel like anybody believed me, because even if they did, it wasn't talked about, and my father was still allowed to see me and to visit me, despite my fear. I even remember at the age of 6 him calling me on the phone, and I remember saying, like, hey, do you remember that you did this to me? Because even at 3 and at 6, I knew that something was off. Something was very wrong about that. And he convinced me that it was all just a bad dream. So that's where my reality was shaken, because I think it was so difficult for me to imagine that was real, that it was easier to believe that and to say, okay, I guess it was just a bad dream. I guess it was something that I made up in my head. And so even if there were other signs after that age, between 6 and 16, even if there were signs there, in my head it was, no, that was just a dream, or that was just something else. All these excuses came up. So when the flashback memories happened, it was so clear. It was like oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't make this up. And I spent the next couple of years trying to speak with my family about it, trying to basically tell my truth, and it wasn't received very kindly.
How so? Again, anything you don't want to share, you're welcome to say, I don't want to share that.
Of course. Often with survivors of sexual abuse, telling your story to people, it's something that is very taboo, and people don't want to hear about it, especially if it's a family member.
Right.
And at that point, my father's side of the family, they know him more than they know me. They grew up with him.
Right.
So it wasn't like they took his side, but they heard me out, and then I essentially didn't hear very much from them again. and I lost my family by telling that story. With my mother's side of the family, it was when I was going through that at 17, I grew up in a very authoritarian family, so feelings and emotions and thoughts and opinions were all not very welcome.
I see.
It was kind of the mentality of children should be seen and not heard necessarily. And, they signed the paperwork to put me in therapy, but we just didn't talk about it much.
This was after your realization and confrontation? That's when they signed the papers to put you in therapy?
Yeah.
I see.
And so therapy was really good for me. I did find a really good therapist. I also went to go see a psychiatrist because that's, what one does when one's behavior changes so drastically. I went from being a fairly happy teenager to just needing to sleep all day and barely being able to function. I would often freeze up in catatonic states, meaning just extended periods of time where I couldn't move any muscle in my body. And when I went to go see the psychiatrist, this is kind of where it all begins for me. I spent 15 minutes in his office telling him what happened. Another detail is also that right around this time, my best friend in high school committed suicide. So it was kind of just a year of like,
a lot of things,
what is
just
happening to me?
Wow, that's tough.
Yeah, so I went to go see the psychiatrist and told him all of this in about 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, I got supposedly 3 preliminary diagnoses, which were situational depression, bipolar mania, and catatonic schizophrenia. And I just kind of thought that was absurd. I was like, hey, I told you that all of these really traumatic things happened to me, and to me it makes a lot of sense why my body would be freezing up as a reaction, or why I would be sleeping all day, and why my whole life and my body and my mind and everything would be so shaken. And you're sitting over there telling me that I have 3 different diseases of the brain?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense.
And I also feel like, and I don't know if this is true in the psychiatrist community or in the psychologist community, but I feel like in the layman's terms, when somebody is said to have schizophrenia, suddenly everybody just dismisses that person as crazy. Mm-hmm. Did you feel that happened at all with your friends, or were you not sharing this stuff at all, or what sort of was there any change between you and your friends during this period?
There were definitely changes between my friends and I, but the changes were mostly that I was known as the person who everyone came to for advice and support, and all of a sudden I couldn't offer that anymore.
That's so interesting, because I know you as a person who gives very good advice and very good support, so that's surprising to me. But again, I wasn't there at the time. I understand that things were different.
I couldn't.
Perhaps.
I tried, but I could barely take care of myself.
Right.
That all of a sudden, at least the amount that I could be there for other people dropped significantly. And so that shifted a lot of my friendships. But in terms of the diagnoses, I think I literally, even at 17, I literally was like, that is absurd. I am not using those labels to describe myself at all. And so I didn't tell them to anyone, not because I was ashamed, but because I just thought that they were ridiculous.
You would be giving them strength in a way if you said like, oh, I'm this, and then you become that kind of thing, right? Yeah.
And also, he also gave me a prescription for the antipsychotic Abilify, which I took for about a month, and it made me even more depressed. And I noticed that it definitely helped. It helped in terms of I wasn't feeling anything anymore.
Right.
But not feeling anything made me feel like I wasn't myself, and made me feel like I wasn't grappling with these things that were happening to me. And even though it was hard, I wanted to. So I stopped taking the medication.
What are your thoughts in general towards antipsychotics and other mental health medications?
As a first thought, I want to say that I fully support anyone's treatment decisions. And so I would not say that they should be taken away entirely and that they're the most horrible thing on the planet and that no one should use them. I would never say that. What I would say is that psychopharmaceuticals in general were created obviously to help people and to support people, but at the time that they were created, evidence for psychopharmaceuticals was used as evidence to say that mental illnesses exist.
Interesting.
Which I find really problematic. So the fact that some people benefited from taking these medications, which maybe change some of the chemical things in your brain, was used as a way to say, hey, look, these things actually exist because when we give people this pill, they feel better. So it is an illness. And that's, I mean,
that's a little bit absurd, because if you gave me that pill, I would also feel different.
Exactly.
I have a teacher, an acupuncture, Chinese medicine, herbs and acupuncture teacher, who's a psychiatrist. He was a psychiatrist in Taiwan, and one of the things he did, as psychotic as this might be, he tried every single medication before he prescribed to the patient. Now, I have a lot of respect for that. I say psychotic jokingly, obviously. I have a lot of respect for that, because he said, if I'm going to prescribe this to somebody, I need to know what they're going to feel.
Right.
So he experienced those symptoms, and he doesn't have any diagnoses. Not to say that he wouldn't be diagnosed with something. I don't think he would. But it's the same thing. That I don't think that's a fair way to assess whether something exists or not, if you have a change. So
exactly. I put it on the same level of, someone smoking marijuana, or someone kind of using these drugs that are not legal yet and are not typically used in that way, but to me, I see all of those things, and even herbal remedies as well. I see all of those on a very similar level. It just happens to be that some of them are regulated by the government and some of them aren't. The only thing that is also different about psychopharmaceuticals is that a lot of the research that's done on psychopharmaceuticals and the companies that make them are very corrupt. And there's a lot of wrong information that goes around about them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and that's something that happens ultimately, I think, with anybody who is involved in making a lot of money from things like this. So I mean, that's unfortunately what's going to happen with any sort of company like that, and it's especially bad when it affects mental health, but health of any sort. And I think that happens in medicine through and through, not just mental health.
I think as long as people know that by taking a psychopharmaceutical, they are not taking the cure to the disease that they have, as long as they know that it's a form of treatment, just like herbal remedies, just like psychotherapy, just like any kind of treatment, that as long as that's known, there can be a safe way to do that.
It seems more like in Chinese medicine we call it root and branch. Branch is when you're treating sort of the symptomology. The root is when you're treating the reason for the symptomology. What's causing the symptomology in the first place? And it seems like psychopharmaceuticals are mainly treating kind of the branch. Just, get rid of these particular symptoms that are showing up, although also add all these other extra symptoms that didn't exist before. And, but yeah, I hear that. So anyway, let me get you back to the story. I'm sorry, I totally diverted you. But, so you were at the place where you got diagnosed with these four diagnoses? Three diagnoses. Okay, go on.
Yeah. So at that point, it just left a lot of questions for me about, is this trauma, or is everything that I'm going through directly related to this trauma? Is there something going on in my brain? What is everything that's in between that? And I, of course, wound up going to college for applied psychology.
Right.
And I left my family. I did kind of like the socially acceptable way of running away from home.
Did the psychologists and psychiatrists involved not immediately pull you away from your family?
No, there was my psychologist, my therapist. She did call, I forget what the state agency is called in California, maybe CPS, to file a report, but because my father wasn't living with me at the time, it was very low priority.
I see.
So, no, and my other family life with my mother and my stepfather were also very problematic, and there were a lot of issues that I had with where I lived and where I grew up, and not to mention that my best friend passed away there, so it was literally just a big graveyard for me. And I needed to get out, so I got a good amount of scholarships and was lucky enough to be able to come to New York and go to New York University for applied psychology, and my college years were a huge struggle, huge struggle, because not only was I in a place that I didn't really know anyone and I had to start a new life, but also I had to deal with the pressures of college, and also I was having catatonic states like every week or so, and
Right.
I was still so depressed and reeling from everything that was happening. But I got through college, and I spent my summers doing anything that I could to not go back to California. I took different jobs or went traveling or couch surfing, and the most recent part of the story happened about 7 months ago or 6 months ago.
Yeah.
It was while I was working as a crisis counselor, as I mentioned, and it was during October, which is that flashback month. That's when that
It generally hits you in October.
Right.
I see.
And that's when I had my first, what we would call, psychotic episode. I began to see and hear things that other people don't see and hear. And I had episodes of increasing, they happened more and more frequently, so eventually they'd happen pretty much every other day or so, and I would do my best. It would always happen at night, interestingly enough, and so I was able to go to work in the morning to do my job as a crisis counselor, to spend time with my family, and then I would go home and I would have a psychotic episode. And again, I did notice that these experiences for me, they were definitely related to the trauma. I was definitely experiencing things that brought up old memories for me, old thoughts, old emotions, and at the same time, there were so many other factors involved. So I guess this is where I land now, in that, yes, trauma is a very significant factor that adds into a lot of people's experiences, but there are so many other ones as well, and that's
yeah,
where
of
I'm
course,
at.
I'm sure. As you know, I think you're an extremely brave person, and you've definitely come a long way. You're very wise. You're a great advisor in general. In fact, I think that's sort of how I met you. The guy you're dating now, you were kind of advising him at the time about stuff, and we were kind of advising him together. We agreed on a lot of things, and obviously you're always like, oh, this person's really smart because they agree with me. So maybe I'm just stroking my own ego here. I don't know. So you leave the crisis counseling and you join this organization called Icarus.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about what Icarus is, what it's about, and how it differs from crisis counseling?
Sure, yeah. So like I said, the Icarus Project was an organization that was started by people who experienced extreme states, or what we call mental illness, and they definitely struggled, or noticed a lot of the struggles that people had within the system, and wanted to kind of create a support network or an alternative for people who experience those things without having to be labeled or diagnosed or treated a certain way or treated like they're crazy. So they started some really wonderful things. They have a couple of publications, they had an online forum, they had people who went around and did some workshops and trainings as well, and now there are a lot of different state chapters of the Icarus Project, and I'm part of Icarus NYC, and it was really wonderful to be part of a group of people who, I could come and sit in meetings or come to their events, and no one would treat you like a schizophrenic. No one would treat you like you're bipolar. It would be a question as to whether or not you identified as that.
Interesting.
And everything was just very welcoming, so I began organizing with them and doing a couple of workshops myself.
Do you feel ever that people who have a specific diagnosis, whether that diagnosis be right or wrong, sort of get married to their disease and feel like, oh, this is me, I am this, and they define their lives in a way around that, and they're like, well, no, this is how I am, and is it harder to help those people who are so married to their diagnosis that they don't even want, but they don't even know how to separate from it?
I think it's a really natural human instinct
Absolutely.
to want an answer.
I see.
One answer that's simple, that's labeled, that exists. The problem with that is, especially when you're talking about human emotions and conditions, they cannot be boxed in that way at all.
I couldn't agree more.
I mean, there's even, if you talk about the DSM in general, sure, you could categorize people like that. You could create a list of behaviors and symptoms and fit people into those categories. But one of my biggest qualms is that if it's so easy to put people in categories, why do so many people fit under a million of them?
Right,
or why
of
do
course.
I have 3 diagnoses? If the DSM was so reliable, wouldn't I theoretically fit under 1, maybe 2 boxes?
Right.
But that's not how that works. Everybody has, what I like to say is, what's your recipe for disaster?
What's your recipe for disaster?
What is it?
Right.
I mean, because when I work with people or when I talk to people about mental health, I don't just care about their brain chemistry. I don't even just care about what their traumas are, what their experiences are. It's everything. For example, I know that in my recipe for disaster, there is sexual abuse and incest. There's having a best friend who committed suicide. There are those experiences. There's not having a family or not feeling like I'm supported at all. But there's also things like, what food I grew up on eating, and the fact that I now have celiac disease, which hugely, hugely plays into that. If I eat even like a tiny little bite of something that has gluten in it.
Yeah, I heard you were just diagnosed.
Yeah, I will be depressed. I mean, so depressed and unable to get out of bed for a week and a half.
Yeah, I want to make it clear because I think a lot of people don't have this knowledge. There's a difference between celiac and gluten intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me started on gluten intolerance. It may very well be a thing. I'm not saying it's not. But celiac disease is an actual disease. It is a autoimmune disorder where the cilia in your intestines kind of shrink down, and they're the ones that hold the enzymes that digest gluten, and therefore you don't have those enzymes, and it really does cause issues. And I think a lot of people shit on it because of the kind of gluten-free trend and craze.
Right.
But when somebody has celiac, it's a very different story. So I just wanted to clarify that for, I guess, the listeners, if anybody's listening to this ever.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really important factor. There's also something that people are studying now called the gut-brain connection.
Yeah.
There's a huge connection there. I have suffered from ulcers all of my life, probably due to the celiac disease. And, I'm sure that plays a huge factor in feeling depressed and foggy and dissociated for so much of my life also.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense.
There's also the factor that a lot of times when I'm hearing or seeing things that other people don't, it's what I am hearing and seeing can be both related to my trauma, but also can be deeply transformative spiritual experiences for me as well. I could go on and on about all these different factors that are involved, but I think what's important, another one, political oppressions. Being a woman who was born with 3 fingers, an atypical arm, that, I've been treated in a very particular way because of that. My sexual abuse has been invalidated because of my gender. A lot of things like that play into it.
I do think there's a lot to be said about gender inequality and stuff, and we could certainly talk about that if you want. Do you think, and I have no opinion on this, I'm just asking you, do you think that specifically in sexual abuse that females get kind of ignored more than men, or just differently, or the opposite way, whatever I just said?
I think it depends on the circumstance. I think in terms of sexual harassment, it gets, well, for men, if that comes up, I think it's immediately invalidated because you're the man, you're supposed to be strong. How could you have been abused in that way? That doesn't make sense. That's something that a lot of people can't fathom.
Yeah, sociologically, like the way we tend to view things, it doesn't make sense.
Right. But also abuse that happens towards women, especially sexual abuse, gets invalidated, not in the sense that people can't imagine that it happened, but there's this idea that it's the woman's fault that it happened. You were wearing a skirt that was too short, you got too drunk,
Yeah, that's
you
bizarre
put
to me.
yourself in that situation. So the invalidation maybe looks a little bit different, but I
Makes
think
sense.
it does happen on both sides.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it happens on both sides. I was just trying to get a feel for how you felt about it.
Yeah. But in general, I think people don't like it when people bring up sexual abuse. It's
People
such
get
a
uncomfortable.
taboo topic.
There's so many things that are taboo topics, and I don't want to say I enjoy taboo topics. That's not the right way to put it, but I like bringing them up because people get really uncomfortable about this stuff, and I think this is the kind of stuff that people need to talk about. And I mean, it goes from stuff like this, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, to the point of talking about death. Mm-hmm. People freak out when you talk about death, which is why I love talking about death. I love joking about death because people are so uncomfortable by it. Other stuff, diseases, cancer, stuff like that. Oh, don't talk about cancer. Don't joke about cancer. My uncle had cancer. Everybody's uncle had cancer, or grandfather, or brother, or sister, or whatever. I guess I joke about it because I do want people to be more comfortable with it and say, yeah, we can talk about this. There's nothing wrong about talking about this, and people don't need to be treated differently because of one little thing that happened here, or one little, not the meaning. I'm not saying little in the sense that it didn't matter, but little in the sense we all have our different traumas and different things, and it's okay to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I very much applaud you for talking about it, because I know a lot of people do keep quiet.
Yeah.
And I hope that if any of the people listening to this program have had any experiences like this, that they take a cue from you and do come out and do talk about it. Mm-hmm. I think that would be great, so thank you for that. But anyway, we can jump back to feminism, because I find it interesting.
I mean, yeah, I was just pointing out that essentially there are so many different factors that come into play when it comes to someone's mental health or the way that they interpret what's going on with them. And sometimes I find that, people come to me and tell me I'm really depressed. I have been this way for so long, but nothing has necessarily changed, and I think that it's just a chronic disorder. But, let's talk about that a little bit more. What's actually going on? What does it focus around? Just because you can't initially find a spark of what made you depressed or what made you behave in a certain way doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of different factors involved. So after a little while of talking, I have a lot of people who eventually realize, oh, it's the fact that I can't pay my rent no matter how much I work because I can't get a job that pays me more than $10 an hour, and in America that's all I'm gonna get, and in New York especially I can't pay anything with that.
Not anymore. We just passed the $15 an hour rule. Right. But still, I totally understand what you're saying. There are all these factors that we don't even consider.
Right.
That we just go oh, okay, well, this person can't pay their rent or whatever. And even people who can pay their rent but are so tight on money that every month they're super stressed, and people don't realize how much that plays into somebody's emotional well-being, and eventually that leads to also physical illness as well.
Right.
And we sort of ignore that because it's not part of the linear kind of thinking, linear thought.
Right.
You have disease because this microbe did this, but what allowed that to happen in the first place? I mean, I'm going to get into a rant about Chinese medicine. Let's not do that now. Go ahead.
But, yeah, I'm not saying to blame capitalism or to blame gender inequality or to blame history. But I think that's the point. What people get stuck in a lot is playing the blame game. So blame it on my chemical imbalance, blame it on this disorder, blame it on even people's personality sometimes. That happens a lot, and that creates a lot of stigma too of, oh, I'm just a lazy, unmotivated, depressed person. That's just who I am. So they blame themselves, or friends blame them, or blame it on, the abuser. The abuser probably is someone who does deserve blame. But what I'm saying is that it's not necessarily helpful to do that and look for one concrete thing. What's helpful is to say, as I mentioned, what's your recipe?
Yeah, the interrelation of things.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on somebody like your father and how society should view him?
Does that mean how do I want society to view people who perpetrate sexual abuse?
And let's remove it from your father. I said your father, but somebody like him, somebody who was a perpetrator of sexual abuse.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how you think society should view those people?
Well, I guess I'm not sure that there should be one overarching attitude towards someone who perpetrates abuse. I think that again, the factors are very complex.
Of course, as always.
I know for my father in particular, he also was diagnosed, but he was diagnosed with borderline and narcissistic personality disorders.
Right.
Personality disorders are something that I still feel definitely even more fuzzy about than things like depression or bipolar mania.
I think psychology in general feels fuzzy about them.
Right. What does it mean to have like a diseased personality? I don't really know.
Yeah.
But I definitely think the attitude towards people who perpetrate violence and sexual abuse in particular should not be immediately forgiving nor immediately condemning. I think that it should be an attitude of what were the things that came into play that made this person perpetrate this act, and where can healing happen? There's an idea, especially in collective and feminist and activist circles, called transformative justice. And so especially when that person is part of your immediate family or your society or your workplace or your collective or your community, there becomes a question of how can we work with this person to get them to realize all of the multifaceted factors in what they did, how harmful that was for the victim, and how can we allow healing to happen here? How can we educate that person? How can we create some kind of healing? But obviously that's a very idealistic way of thinking.
It is an idealistic way of thinking, but I tend to agree with you. I feel like those people, when they do things like that, which are unforgivable, for lack of a better word, it's like a black mark, and then it's just, we're done with this person. When I think that maybe sometimes there's room for helping that person, that person clearly has something that caused them to do that. And again, I'm not being apologetic in any way whatsoever. I think what they do is horrible. But how can we help them to get better so that they don't do things like that again, or so that other people who are thinking about doing something like that can come out in public, not in public to everyone, but say to a psychologist, listen, I'm thinking of doing this, and it's something that I have in me, and I don't want to do it. How can I get help? Offer help for people before they do the actions. You see what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that when it comes to people who perpetrate violence and abuse, there are reasons, but there aren't excuses.
No, I don't think there are excuses at all. I agree.
That allows there to be room for taking responsibility for your actions, but also recognizing that those actions are layered with a lot.
And don't mistake me, I definitely do think those people should absolutely take responsibility for their actions. Yeah. And whatever form that takes is the further question, and I don't know that I have an opinion or even a thought on that, or what would be the appropriate or inappropriate, or to what level is it punishment, and to what level is it rehab. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying.
Right. But at the same time, we don't even have the structures in place to give what I would call proper support to survivors and victims of abuse, let alone perpetrators. You know what I mean?
That's true. If we're gonna take our resources and put them somewhere, I would agree that it's gonna be the survivors of abuse who are gonna get the help first. Right. The perpetrators.
Well, not even one before the other, but like.
Well, if you have a lack of resources, I mean, not in general, but yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely the care of the person who's been abused, I think, comes first by a mile, and then some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess, the place for abusers, I would not prefer that place to be somewhere like prison, but I would prefer it to be a place where they do not get to perpetuate what happened or to harm anyone else,
right.
But a place where they can explore what's going on with them, just like a victim or a survivor like myself needs to spend a good portion of my life sitting down with this understanding or developing my own narrative and understanding about what is going on with me as well.
What is your relationship, not your actual relationship, but your relationship with, I suppose, the idea of your father these days? How do you view him? How are you just completely over it? I don't have to worry about that man anymore. He's so far away from me, and there's no way he's coming anywhere near me.
It only comes up every once in a while. The only way that I have contact with him is over Facebook, ironically enough. I do not want him to have my address or anything of the sort. I have not contacted him in about 4 years, I would say. However, he, as I imagine and has expressed in the past, feels a lot of guilt. But for me, there was so much of a lack of trust, and I never even had... It would be one thing if this person had been in my life consistently, but even between the ages of 3 and 17, he was in and out of my life very irregularly. So I never had a very strong connection with him in the first place, that it wasn't very difficult for me to say, okay, I'm never seeing you again. And that was a personal choice that I needed to make, and that may change in the future, but right now it seems very unlikely. Not necessarily for the fact that I'm concerned about my own safety, but more in the sense that I'm concerned about the fact that even when I was around him, even in the good times that I had with him, we were not necessarily close, and I never viewed him really as a father figure.
That's
so
fair.
There were a lot of other aspects in his personality and in his self that I did not want to be around.
Makes
for
sense.
More reasons than just the sexual abuse.
Of course.
So the only times that it's come up is when, he asks me if he can come to some kind of event like my college graduation or something of the sort, and I would have to say no.
And your relationship with your mother, if I may ask?
Oh, that's a more complicated one.
Oh, is it?
Much, much more. There was a lot of grief in the sense that I think my mother affected me a lot more even than he did because I was around her much more. So we've always had a very complicated relationship. I never felt like I connected with her much growing up, and I'm grateful that she raised me to be a very independent person, but at the same time, growing up very independent was also growing up very lonely and
Right.
feeling like I didn't have any emotional support. And between the two of them, my mother and my stepfather, I'm sure they would have a much different story, but my perception was that I was not usually allowed to voice my opinions or my feelings or be validated in any way. That has changed, though, I'm happy to say, in the last
So you still have
couple of
somewhat
years.
of a relationship with her?
Somewhat. It's been much more recently that I felt like I could really be able to start to have some kind of relationship with her and forgive her for not protecting me, for knowing and not doing anything about it, and forgive her for not being a perfect parent. And while I do consider it what happened throughout my childhood from both her and my stepfather, I do consider it emotional abuse. I know that that's a strong word, and it's kind of a tricky word that people stumble over often.
I don't think that in this case at least, knowing what we know now, what you've told us, I don't think it's unfair to say that even if there's nothing other than what you've told us that they knew and they didn't do anything, I think that in itself is emotional abuse.
Sure.
So I don't think you need to be careful about throwing that word around.
Yeah. So while I do still consider it that, I also leave more room now knowing that I've been outside of that environment for a very long time. I'm also not a child anymore, and I think that they see me a lot more as a capable adult, and I'm not as concerned about any more abuse being perpetrated, that I think I can finally start to have a bit of a relationship with them. I don't think it will be perfect, and I think that, for them learning how to be parents to a young adult, and for me learning how to be a daughter, again,
Right.
it's not an easy thing, but there's definitely room there to grow.
Have they expressed to you any regret as to their actions?
In regards to not keeping me safe, yes, definitely. I think that at the same time that I was going through all of the flashbacks, my mother was also going through a very difficult time realizing the repercussions of what happened. And yes, there was a lot of shame and guilt expressed for that. For the, what I would call emotional abuse, not necessarily, but I do think that they've begun to take on much more of an attitude of, you're welcome to come over anytime. Anytime that I do see them now, which is not very often because they live in California, but the more recent times that I've seen them, they've been a little bit more welcoming towards me and my ideas. I've felt like I've been heard and validated. That's a little
nice.
bit more. It might just be because I'm older, and
right.
because in authoritarian families there tends to be this idea of, you're young, you don't know anything, you shouldn't speak, whereas now I'm 22 and I've been without them for 5 years, and I think they have a little bit.
I did not know you were 22. I thought you were much older than that. You carry yourself as a not in looks in any way, but in personality, you carry yourself as a much more mature person than a 22-year-old, which obviously there are many mature 22-year-olds. I'm not here to insult 22-year-olds in any way. I was an immature one.
I had to take care of myself for a really long time,
right.
starting at a very young age. So.
Do you have any siblings?
No, it's just me.
All right. I think that's a good place to end. I really, really appreciate you coming on.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go, is there anything you want to promote? Any message you want to give to other people who have had a situation sort of like yours or somewhat similar? Anything you want to say? An album that you sing in that you might want to promote?
Yeah, definitely. Check out the Icarus Project. They're a really great organization. Definitely, if you have undergone sexual or emotional abuse, incest, if you have mourned and grieved for a friend, if you or anybody you know has been diagnosed and don't know how to handle it, don't know how to interpret it, if you've struggled with the psychiatric system or the biomedical model or psychiatry or psychology in general, you are definitely not alone. If you feel like there are no alternatives or places where you can go, you're not alone. One thing I will promote is if you are in crisis, Parachute NYC is an amazing organization that is one of the closest things we have right now to peer support, because they have peer workers who have been through and experienced extreme states, and I believe that peer workers are so vital to providing support in a much more grounded way than psychiatrists or psychologists sometimes. So Parachute NYC is something to look up, and also you can find my writings, my photography, my art projects, and anything else that I do on jazminerussell.com.
All of which are very good, by the way. I checked out your website a little bit. I wanted to read more, but I didn't get a chance to. I just got home. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Let me shut this shit down. And that's show. Hey, thanks so much for listening. If you like the show, rate us on iTunes, donate $1, whatever you can, to the show so that we can continue improving the quality and putting out better shows as we go on. Check us out at thegeneralistpodcast@gmail.com. Nope, that's my email. Rather, check us out at thegeneralistpodcast.com. Email I just said, so you can send them there. Send us your hate mail to @thegeneralistpc on Twitter. I decided that would be a better place to receive your hate mail. I don't know why. Maybe it's just as bad. We'll find out. Or don't send us any hate mail. That's kind of cool too. And enjoy your week. We should be uploading another episode in about 2 weeks. It's going to most likely be with Cassie Sainuk, who is a award-winning playwright, producer, and stage manager. It was a fun episode to record, so I'll catch you back in a couple of weeks. Enjoy.